Everyone laughed at the poorly dressed woman at the will reading, until the lawyer read the truth, until she inherited the entire fortune. When Emily Hart stepped into the grand hall for the reading of the will, she immediately drew stares filled with disdain. Dressed in a simple gray linen dress, a worn-out beige cardigan, and quiet flats, she looked painfully out of place among the crowd of polished heirs draped in designer suits and glittering jewels. Whispers ignited almost instantly, sharp and cutting, branding her as either a lowly housekeeper, a pitiful hanger-on, or perhaps some desperate former lover chasing a payout. Every smirk and sideways glance was a silent verdict that she didn't belong in their world of privilege and pedigree. Emily, however, gave no reaction. She simply adjusted the strap of her faded cloth bag and moved to the back of the room, settling near a tall window that overlooked the misty hills beyond the estate. She stood there quietly, head held high, refusing to let the sneers and judgment claw their way under her skin. The marble floors echoed under the sharp heels and polished shoes of the guests, but Emily's soft steps went unnoticed, like a shadow slipping through a room that had already decided her worth. In the faces around her, she saw nothing but arrogance and greed, but she remained still, her calm presence a stark contrast to the simmering contempt that filled the air. To them, she was invisible, a mistake, a nobody daring to step into a space reserved for those of blood and legacy. Yet Emily's silence wasn't weakness, it was patience, because she knew something they didn't. And before the day was over, the very people laughing at her would come to realize just how gravely they had misjudged the quiet woman standing alone in the corner. As soon as Emily Hart chose her quiet corner by the window, the room's polished vultures began circling with their cutting words and sharper smirks. Nolan Hayes, dressed in a gleaming gold tie, was the first to sneer loudly enough for others to hear, joking that the cleaning staff must have gotten lost. His sister, Vivian Hayes, tall and draped in a crimson silk gown, laughed and suggested maybe Emily had come to polish the will before it was read. Across the room, Olivia Monroe, a rising tech entrepreneur desperate for social media clout, pointed her phone at Emily and snapped a quick photo, her perfectly manicured fingers already flying across the screen as she whispered to her friend Danielle Pierce, a former executive assistant eager for attention. Olivia cackled as she posted the photo with a cruel caption suggesting Emily thought thrift store fashion could buy her $1 billion estate. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and cold, as others pulled out their phones to like, comment, and share the post, the digital mockery spreading like wildfire. Emily stood silently, aware of the camera flashes and snide whispers, but showing no sign of the humiliation they intended to heap on her. Her stillness, far from weakness, only seemed to fuel their vicious amusement. As the insults escalated, Trevor Langston, a smug, distant cousin known more for his cruel pranks than for any actual accomplishments, sidled up near her under the pretense of pouring a drink. With a sly grin, he scribbled charity case in bold letters on a cocktail napkin and slyly tucked it into the strap of Emily's plain cloth bag when she wasn't looking. The move drew a fresh wave of laughter as guests elbowed each other, pointing at the makeshift label hanging from her shoulder like a scarlet letter. Olivia was quick to capture another photo, her laughter barely suppressed as she whispered gleefully about how Emily had officially become a living, breathing meme. Danielle snorted with mock pity, commenting that the poor thing probably didn't even realize she had been turned into a walking joke. The cruelty in the air thickened, each glance, each whisper, and each stifled giggle layering humiliation over Emily's steady figure. Yet through it all, she remained motionless, her hazel eyes focused ahead, refusing to acknowledge the mob mentality clawing for her dignity. To them, her silence was weakness, a green light for their ridicule to spiral even further. But beneath Emily's quiet exterior, there was a strength none of them could fathom, a patience rooted in something far deeper than the shallow approval they sought from each other. And while they thought they were tearing her apart, they were, in truth, writing the first lines of their own downfall, one mocking laugh at a time. Through every whispered insult, every snicker behind a champagne glass, and every flash of a mocking camera, Emily Hart remained absolutely still, a calm island in the middle of a storm she had seen coming long before she ever stepped foot into the Grand Hall. Though her plain gray dress and faded cardigan marked her as an easy target for their cruelty, Emily never flinched, never fought back, never even so much as lowered her gaze. She simply stood with the quiet grace of someone who knew exactly what was unfolding and exactly why it needed to happen. While the heirs sneered and sharpened their knives against her dignity, Emily silently counted the hidden security cameras mounted high in the corners of the ornate room, their red lights blinking unnoticed by the crowd, too drunk on their own self-importance to realize they were being watched. Every word, every smirk, every ugly reveal of their true nature was being recorded, stored in servers she and someone else had carefully arranged months ago. This was no accident, no random humiliation. It was a crucible designed with meticulous precision, a test built to strip away the polished masks and expose what lay underneath. She and Nathaniel Cross, the man whose empire these vultures thought they were about to inherit, had crafted this moment together in secrecy, long before the world believed him gone. Nathaniel had known he could not trust their shiny smiles or rehearsed condolences, so he had left behind not just a will, but a stage upon which the truth would reveal itself without any prompting. Emily was here not to defend herself or seek pity, but to stand silently as a mirror, reflecting the greed, vanity, and cruelty of those who had always considered themselves above judgment. Each cruel laugh and whispered slur was a note in the symphony of their own undoing, and Emily recorded it all not with a camera of her own, but with her unwavering presence. She understood that silence was its own kind of power, a force far stronger than rage or rebuttal, and she wielded it with a mastery they would only recognize far too late. Every sneer they threw at her was a piece of evidence, a silent confession broadcast to a hidden audience waiting for the final act. Emily did not need their approval, nor their acceptance. She needed only their true colors to surface under the pressure of their own arrogance, and they were delivering it perfectly, willingly, without a clue that they were sealing their own fate. She stayed there, by the window, the hills rolling misty and endless behind her, waiting with quiet certainty for the moment when the world they thought they ruled would begin to collapse. Because she knew something they didn't. The real power in that room had never been in their manicured hands. It had always been in hers. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy doors at the front of the grand hall swung open, and the room fell into a hush as Arthur Benson, Nathaniel Cross's longtime lawyer, entered carrying a worn leather briefcase that seemed almost absurdly ordinary compared to the glittering luxury surrounding him. His sharp gray suit and weathered face radiated authority, the kind earned through decades of managing fortunes and witnessing the very worst of human greed. Arthur moved with deliberate steps to the mahogany table at the front, placed the briefcase down, and without a single word of preamble, pulled out a single sealed envelope. The crowd of polished heirs leaned forward, breathless with anticipation, their hunger for power palpable in the still air. Emily Hart remained in her quiet corner, her simple gray dress and worn cardigan making her look like a misplaced servant among kings. But she watched Arthur with steady eyes, knowing the world was about to tilt. Arthur cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and broke the seal, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. He unfolded the heavy parchment and began to read, his voice firm and emotionless. I, Nathaniel Cross, being of sound mind, declare this my final will and testament. To my family, colleagues, and associates, I leave nothing but this truth. Wealth reveals character, not worth. The room visibly recoiled as if slapped. Murmurs rose like the first rumbles of a coming storm, confusion and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Nolan Hayes, who had earlier mocked Emily without mercy, blinked rapidly as if trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Olivia Monroe's manicured hand gripped her phone tighter, her lips parting in stunned silence. Arthur continued unfazed, his voice slicing cleanly through the chaos. All my assets, company shares, properties, accounts, and intellectual rights are bequeathed to one person. The one who stood by me for no reason other than love. The one who never sought my name for status. My wife, Emily Hart. The gasp that tore through the room was sharp, disbelieving, almost painful. Heads whipped around, searching for some explanation, some visible trick, but Emily remained where she was, calm and unmoving, her presence suddenly expanding to fill every corner of the grand hall. Nolan barked out a laugh, harsh and strained. Wife? Nathaniel wasn't married. Vivian's face had turned the color of ash, her perfect posture crumbling under the weight of the revelation. Olivia's phone slipped from her hand, clattering unnoticed to the marble floor. Trevor Langston muttered something under his breath about scams and gold diggers, but his voice wavered with fear. Arthur raised a hand, silencing the growing panic, and said with measured authority, "The will is valid, legally witnessed and notarized. Supporting documentation is available for verification." He opened the briefcase again and produced a thick folder, for which he pulled several pieces of evidence. First, a marriage certificate, dated 7 years earlier, bearing Nathaniel Cross's unmistakable signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses. Then, a series of personal letters written in Nathaniel's own hand, their authenticity verified by forensic experts, filled with declarations of love and gratitude addressed to Emily. He placed them carefully on the table, where everyone could see. And finally, Arthur inserted a USB drive into a laptop, and the wall behind him came alive with flickering images. The room watched, paralyzed, as grainy but unmistakable footage appeared. A courthouse steps bathed in sunlight. Nathaniel in a simple navy suit laughing as he held Emily's hand. Emily radiant in a modest white dress that floated gently around her ankles. They kissed, carefree and joyous, while 2 familiar faces, Sarah Ellis and Michael Reed, longtime employees, stood clapping in the background. The date stamped neatly in the corner matched the marriage license exactly. In that moment, the last fragile defenses of the crowd collapsed. Every smug assumption, every whispered insult, every act of cruelty they had thrown at Emily boomeranged back with brutal precision. They had mocked her, scorned her, reduced her to a joke, and now she stood revealed as the one true heir to everything they had schemed to claim. Slowly, gracefully, Emily stepped forward from the shadows, the simple sway of her cardigan and the worn flats on the marble floor now carrying the quiet thunder of inevitability. She walked to Arthur's side, the silence around her deafening, and took the folder he offered with hands that did not tremble. She looked down at the photograph for a moment, her lips curving into a soft, almost private smile. Then she turned to face the stunned crowd. There was no gloating in her expression, no triumphant smirk, only a calm strength that made every silk tie and diamond necklace in the room seem pitifully cheap. Emily Hart, the woman they had ridiculed and dismissed without a second thought, had never needed their approval, and now she held everything they had ever wanted in the quiet strength of her hands. The air inside the grand hall was so thick with tension it felt like it might crack open at any moment as Emily Hart stood at the front, the folder of undeniable proof resting quietly in her hands while the polished air struggled to absorb the devastating truth that the empire they had schemed for was now completely out of their reach. But before any of them could recover enough to launch another accusation or plea, Emily shifted slightly, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "And there's something else you need to know," she said, her hazel eyes steady and unflinching as every face turned toward her desperate for something. "Anything to cling to. Nathaniel Cross isn't dead." The words dropped into the room like a grenade, and for a long suspended moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then a collective gasp tore through the crowd, sharp and raw, disbelieving mutters rippling through the silk and velvet like wildfire, before anyone could shout or demand answers. Emily reached in her cloth bag and pressed a small black remote hidden in her palm. Immediately, the massive wall screen behind Arthur Benson flickered to life again, but this time it wasn't a pre-recorded video or an old photo. It was a live feed, dated and time-stamped with the current hour, showing Nathaniel himself sitting in a dimly lit room, alive and very much real, his familiar lean frame relaxed in a chair. His dark hair touched with streaks of gray, his blue eyes as sharp and piercing as ever. He leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees, studying the camera with a steady, unblinking gaze that seemed to look right through the screen and into the soul of every person watching. A ripple of panic shot through the room. Nolan Hayes stumbled backward, knocking over a champagne glass that shattered on the marble floor. Vivian Hayes clutched the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. Olivia Monroe's perfectly crafted composure crumbled as she covered her mouth with shaking hands. Trevor Langston turned visibly pale, his bravado evaporating. On the screen, Nathaniel spoke, his voice low but resonant, filled with a quiet fury that wrapped around every word. "You thought I was gone," he said, the disappointment in his tone more cutting than any scream. "You thought you could carve up everything I built like vultures picking at a carcass, but I've been here, watching, listening, waiting." His eyes shifted deliberately, almost as if they were focusing directly on Emily through the feed. "And she was right about you," he continued, his voice hardening. "You showed exactly who you are when you thought no one was watching." Emily turned her gaze toward the stunned faces before her, the weight of the truth pressing down harder than any accusation could have. And just as the hall began to buzz again with disbelieving outrage and desperate questions, the massive double doors creaked open once more. And there he was, Nathaniel Cross himself, stepping into the hall in the flesh. Not a ghost or a hologram, but a living, breathing presence, dressed simply in dark slacks and a navy sweater, his travel-worn shoes scuffing softly against the marble floor as he crossed the room without hesitation. The crowd parted for him instinctively, as if a wave were pushing them aside, their bravado dying in the face of the undeniable truth. Nathaniel's gaze never wavered as he moved straight to Emily's side, his hand brushing hers in a brief but anchoring touch, the bond between them visible, unbreakable. As he turned to face the room, his voice calm but laced with ice. This entire reading, this entire setup, was orchestrated by Emily, he said, letting the words settle heavily over the stunned crowd. It was a test, a mirror held up to your true selves, and you failed. His eyes swept the room, sparing no one. When you saw someone you didn't recognize, someone you thought was beneath you, you didn't ask questions, you didn't show kindness, you didn't honor my memory. You mocked her, ridiculed her, and revealed exactly what you valued: status, appearances, greed. Nolan opened his mouth to object, but Nathaniel's stare cut him off before a word could form. Vivian started sobbing silently. Olivia stood frozen, as if rooted to the spot. Trevor shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the exits. But there was no escape from the judgment that had already fallen. Nathaniel continued, his tone final and merciless. Today wasn't just about reading a will. It was about revealing character, and character was the only currency that mattered. He glanced down briefly at Emily, his expression softening before turning back to the crowd. She stood here alone while you tore at her with words meant to humiliate, thinking she was powerless. But she is the only one in this room who ever truly stood by me without expectation, without calculation, without greed. Emily remained silent by his side, her strength now a beacon that made the polished wealth around her seem paper-thin and pitiful. And in that moment, every carefully constructed lie, every cruel joke, every selfish plan shattered irreparably under the weight of their own making. And there was nothing left for them to do but stand there and face the truth they had so desperately tried to bury. The silence that followed Nathaniel Cross's revelation was suffocating, the gilded airs standing frozen like statues caught in the act of their own disgrace. But Nathaniel wasn't finished, his voice cutting through the tension with brutal precision as he reached into his jacket and pulled out another document. Thick and folded crisply, he handed it to Arthur Benson, who unfolded it at the podium and cleared his throat. "This," Arthur announced, "is an addendum to Nathaniel Cross's will enacted immediately and irrevocably." The crowd stiffened instinctively, sensing the axe about to fall but unable to move. All individuals who showed disrespect, cruelty, or malice toward Mrs. Emily Hart during today's proceedings, whether through speech, action, or social media, are hereby disinherited completely, stripped of any claim to Nathaniel Cross's assets, properties, or future dealings. Arthur began reading the names one by one, each syllable hitting the marble floor like a hammer blow. Nolan Hayes. The first name rang out, and Nolan's face drained of color, his polished shoes scuffing backward as two security guards appeared at his sides, firm but calm, escorting him toward the doors despite his sputtering protests. Vivian Hayes. Arthur continued. Vivian gasped, her crimson gown billowing as she stumbled forward, pleading under her breath, but the guards showed no mercy, leading her away from the fortune she had so arrogantly assumed was hers. Olivia Monroe, the next. Name struck like a whip, and Olivia's face crumpled as her phone buzzed violently in her hand. She looked down to find her social media accounts being systematically dismantled in real time, her followers vanishing by the thousands, her sponsorship deals severed by automated termination notices flashing across her screen. She let out a strangled sob as her entire digital empire, the empire she had built on mockery and manipulation, crumbled right before her eyes. Trevor Langston came the next blow. Trevor tried to laugh it off, a thin, desperate sound that fooled no one. His velvet jacket wrinkled as a guard took him firmly by the arm, and he was led away like a petty criminal, the mockery he had once enjoyed turning into a shameful chain around his neck. Arthur continued. Gerald Pierce. The former investor huffed in disbelief, turning beet red and muttering curses under his breath. But he too was marched to the exit without fanfare. Lillian Ward. The last name fell into the stunned air. Lillian clutched her pearl necklace as if it could save her, but even she wasn't spared. And as she stumbled toward the doors, her scattered dignity crunched beneath the weight of her own downfall. The room thinned rapidly as the disgraced heirs were peeled away one by one, their polished appearances and well-rehearsed personas collapsing into hollow shells. Emily Hart stood silently by Nathaniel's side, her presence a quiet storm that had stripped away every falsehood and laid bare the truth. Nathaniel watched them go, his face unreadable but his judgment final. There were no second chances, no apologies that could undo the choices they had made when they thought no one was watching. As Olivia was escorted out, her cracked phone slipped from her trembling fingers, the shattered screen a fitting symbol of her broken ambitions. The remaining guests, the few who had neither mocked nor sneered, stood awkwardly, some with heads bowed in shame, others frozen in stunned silence. The grandeur of the hall no longer felt like power, but like a monument to every cruelty and betrayal they had committed. Nathaniel turned back to Emily, his voice soft enough only she could hear. You gave them every chance, he said, and she nodded once, her expression calm but filled with a bittersweet sadness. They hadn't wanted revenge, only truth, and now they had it, raw and unvarnished. And in the end, it was far more powerful than any fortune ever could have been. As the last of the disgraced heirs were escorted from the grand hall, the heavy doors thudding shut behind them like a final judgment, the room was left strangely quiet, the tension dissolving into something softer, something almost reverent. Nathaniel Cross stood tall beside Emily Hart, his gaze sweeping over the few remaining souls who had chosen kindness over cruelty when it mattered most. There were only three, standing apart from the now-vanished vultures, their heads held high not in arrogance, but in quiet dignity. The first was Margaret Ellis, a nurse with silver-streaked hair and warm, steady hands, who years ago had stood as a witness to Nathaniel and Emily's simple courthouse wedding. Margaret had recognized Emily the moment she walked into the hall, but had said nothing, had offered only a small, respectful nod, choosing dignity over gossip. The second was Daniel Reed, a soft-spoken librarian whose loyalty was carved deep into the fabric of his being. Daniel had once quietly helped Nathaniel and Emily set up a private trust, protecting their union from greedy eyes. And today, though he had watched the crowd sneer and laugh, he had never joined their cruelty, had simply stood with silent disapproval radiating from his quiet stance. The third was Lily Tran, the estate's head groundskeeper, a woman whose hands bore the marks of honest work and whose heart bore no malice. Lily had offered Emily a glass of water when she first entered, not questioning her appearance or her place among the gathering, simply seeing a fellow human being in need of a small kindness. As Nathaniel's sharp blue eyes locked onto each of them, something shifted in the room, a sense of true worth rising above the wreckage of fallen greed. He stepped forward, drawing Emily with him, and spoke with a voice rich with unshakable gratitude. To those who chose decency over cruelty, who saw with their hearts instead of their ambition, know this: you are not forgotten. His words were not grand, but they carried the weight of everything that had just transpired. Emily moved to Margaret first, taking her hand gently in both of hers. "Thank you," Emily said simply, and Margaret's eyes misted with emotion. She squeezed Emily's hand in return. No words needed. Then Emily turned to Daniel, offering a soft smile that he returned with a humble nod, his eyes shining behind his glasses. "You never looked away," Emily said, and Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed down his emotion. Finally, Emily approached Lily, whose weathered hands gripped her hat nervously. "You treated me like a person," Emily said warmly, and Lily smiled, shy but proud. Nathaniel stepped forward again, producing 3 slim envelopes from the inside of his jacket. "A small token," he said, handing one to each of them. "A gift of appreciation and a promise that you will always have a place here." Inside each envelope was not just a generous financial gift, but also a personal letter from Nathaniel himself, offering them positions of trust within the newly reorganized estate, positions that would allow them to continue their honest work without fear of politics or betrayal. The 3 recipients clutched the envelopes with trembling hands, overwhelmed not by the money, but by the recognition of their simple but profound humanity. Emily looked at them, her hazel eyes soft with emotion, and said, "You showed me that even when the world is loud with cruelty, kindness still whispers." In the corners, the room, once filled with the clamor of greed, now felt sacred, a quiet testament to what truly mattered. Outside, the misty hills rolled on under the soft April sky, and for the first time that day, the estate felt alive again, rooted not in wealth or power, but in something far rarer: honor, compassion, and the quiet resilience of good souls who refused to be swept away by the storm. As the last whispers of shame faded into the marble and gold of the empty grand hall, Emily Hart and Nathaniel Cross stood side by side, untouched by the ruins of greed left scattered behind them. The empire that the others had clawed and schemed for lay at their feet. Every company's share, every estate, every patent worth billions, but none of it mattered to Emily. She had never come for the fortune, never for the titles or the sprawling properties. From the very beginning, all she had wanted was him, the man who had chosen her not for wealth or appearances, but for the quiet strength and love she carried within. She turned to look up at Nathaniel, her hazel eyes shining with something deeper than triumph, something quieter and infinitely more powerful: relief, gratitude, and an unshakable love that had endured the fires of betrayal and come through untouched. Nathaniel, ever steady, ever hers, reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with a silent promise that spoke louder than any ceremony or signature. The great hall, once filled with the echo of false laughter and cruel words, now felt stripped bare and honest under the soft April light filtering through the tall windows. Outside, the mist curled over the rolling hills like a gentle veil, washing everything clean. Emily leaned slightly into Nathaniel's side, feeling the steady beat of his heart and knowing that in the end, this was all she had ever needed. The world might measure wealth in numbers, but she measured hers in the way his hand anchored hers, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, and the quiet peace that now surrounded them. They didn't speak, that they didn't need to. The truth was carved into every glance, every small smile, every heartbeat shared between them. As they stood there, alone but complete, it became clear that no fortune, no empire, no amount of gold could ever compare to what they had fought for and preserved: their love, their loyalty, and their unbreakable bond. Emily knew that the world outside would never fully understand, that some would only see the headlines or the money. But she didn't care. The real victory wasn't in the inheritance or the downfall of the greedy. It was in the simple fact that love, honest, patient, enduring love, had survived, and in surviving, it had won. Hand in hand, Emily and Nathaniel turned away from the center of the grand hall, leaving behind the empty chairs and broken ambitions, stepping out into the cool morning where the mist kissed the earth and the future stretched before them wide and open and entirely their own. Because in the end, the only legacy that mattered was the life they would build together, not for appearances, not for power, but for the quiet, precious joy of belonging wholly to each other. And that was something no betrayal could ever steal. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the true things worth fighting for, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Cracks of Light for more powerful, emotional stories that shine a light into the darkest places. Your support means the world to us. And together, we'll keep sharing the stories that truly matter.